4 times in the last 500 years, a single currency dominated global trade. Merchants across continents priced goods in it. Governments hoarded it in vaults. Central banks held it as reserves. And every time, that currency died following the exact same 5-stage pattern: Spanish silver, Dutch guilders, British pounds, French francs, 4 reserve currencies, 4 complete collapses. And right now, some analysts observe the US dollar showing signs of entering the later stages of that same sequence. The pattern isn't hidden in classified archives. It's documented in central bank records, trade ledgers, and the economic autopsies of fallen empires. Stage 1. Dominance through military or economic superiority. Stage 2. Overextension as the empire finances more obligations than production supports. Stage 3. Currency debasement to bridge the gap between spending and revenue. Stage 4. Loss of trust as trading partners seek alternatives. Stage 5. Replacement by a new dominant currency. The timeline varies. Spanish silver took 90 years to die, the French franc collapsed in under 2 years, but the sequence never changes. Here's what nobody tells you about reserve currency death. It doesn't feel like a crisis while you're in stages 1 through 3. The currency still works. Markets still accept it. Life continues normally. But beneath the surface, the mathematical foundation is cracking. And once Stage 4 begins, once trust breaks, the acceleration to Stage 5 is brutal and irreversible. By the time citizens realize what's happening, their savings have already been destroyed. This is the documented history of how money dies, why every dominant currency eventually falls, and what the pattern reveals about the present moment. The question isn't whether the dollar could follow this path. The question is which stage we're in. Let me show you exactly how the pattern works, because understanding the mechanism is the only way to see it operating in real time. The 5-stage framework emerged from comparative analysis of every reserve currency collapse over the past 5 centuries. Stage 1 is dominance. A nation achieves military supremacy, controls critical trade routes, or produces goods the world needs. That power allows its currency to become the medium of international exchange. Spanish silver dominated because Spain controlled the richest mines in the Americas. The British pound dominated because the Royal Navy controlled the seas and British manufacturing led the world. Dominance isn't declared. It's earned through superior production or force. Stage 2 is overextension. The empire that issues the reserve currency faces a unique temptation. It can print money to finance armies, buy foreign goods, and fund domestic consumption because the world needs that currency for trade. But production capacity doesn't increase just because you print more currency. The gap between printed money and real economic output is the original sin that begins the death sequence. Spain used American silver to fund wars across Europe. Britain borrowed to maintain an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. Both spent far more than they produced. Both assumed the system would continue indefinitely. Stage 3 is debasement. When tax revenue can't cover spending and borrowing becomes expensive, governments devalue their currency. Historically, that meant mixing cheap metals into silver coins. In the modern era, it means expanding the money supply faster than economic growth. Either way, each unit of currency buys less. Prices rise. Holders of the currency lose purchasing power. Foreign nations holding reserves quietly begin diversifying. Debasement doesn't announce itself with a press release. It happens gradually, justified as necessary stimulus or crisis response, until suddenly the currency is worth a fraction of what it once was. Stage 4 is loss of trust. This is the critical inflection point. Foreign governments, merchants, and investors begin seeking alternatives. They don't announce they're abandoning the reserve currency. They just start accepting other forms of payment. They shift central bank reserves from the dominant currency to gold, competing currencies or commodities. Trade agreements begin pricing in alternative currencies. And once the flight begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more nations diversify away, the less dominant the currency becomes, which makes other nations more willing to diversify. Stage 4 is the avalanche. Once it starts, stopping it requires either military force or complete economic restructuring. Neither is easy. Neither usually works. Stage 5 is replacement. A new currency, or sometimes multiple currencies, assumes the reserve role. The old currency doesn't disappear. It becomes regional, used domestically but no longer demanded internationally. The nation that issued it loses the ability to print money the world needs. Inflation strikes home. Living standards collapse. The empire contracts. Stage 5 is the final confirmation that the pattern has run its course. This framework isn't theoretical. It's the distilled pattern from 4 documented currency deaths, and each one started the same way, with an empire that thought it was different. In 1550, Spain controlled half the world's known silver supply. The mines at Potosi in Bolivia produced such staggering quantities that Spanish silver reals became the first global currency. Merchants from Manila to Madrid to Mexico City priced transactions in reales. The Spanish Empire stretched across 4 continents. The wealth seemed infinite. And that was Stage 1, undisputed dominance. Stage 2 arrived almost immediately. King Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, fought wars simultaneously against the Ottoman Empire, Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, France, and England. Spanish troops occupied Portugal, Italy, and the Philippines. The military expenditures were staggering. By 1580, half of all Spanish revenue went to debt service on loans financing these wars. They were spending more than even infinite silver could cover. Here's the mechanism that made collapse inevitable. The silver flooding into Spain didn't stay in Spain. It immediately flowed back out to pay for imported goods and foreign wars. Spain produced almost nothing domestically. Why build ships when you can buy them with silver? Why grow food when you can import it? The silver created the illusion of wealth while destroying productive capacity. And when costs exceeded even the massive silver inflows, Spain entered Stage 3, debasement. Spanish mints started mixing copper into silver coins. A real that was supposed to be 95% pure silver became 75% silver, then 50%, then 25%. By 1600, Spanish coins contained barely any silver. The face value stamped on the coin stayed the same, but the actual metal value plummeted. Merchants across Europe began refusing Spanish currency at face value. They demanded more coins for the same goods. Inflation exploded inside Spain. A loaf of bread that cost 1 real in 1550 cost 8 reals in 1600. Stage 4 arrived in the early 1600s. Foreign governments and merchants lost trust in Spanish currency. They started demanding payment in other forms: Dutch guilders, gold, or goods. International trade that once flowed through Spanish silver found alternative currencies. And the Spanish economy, hollowed out by a century of importing everything and producing nothing, collapsed inward. By 1640, Spain had declared bankruptcy 4 times. 4 times in 83 years. Each time they restructured debts, promised reforms, and then immediately resumed borrowing and spending. Stage 5 was complete. The Spanish silver real ceased to be the global reserve currency. The Dutch guilder took its place. Spain remained a regional power for another century, but the era of Spanish monetary dominance was finished. The empire had run through all 5 stages in less than a century. Here's why this matters. The pattern that killed Spanish silver wasn't unique to Spain. It was the currency death sequence revealing itself for the first time in the modern era. And 150 years later, it repeated with Britain. In 1815, after defeating Napoleon, Britain emerged as the undisputed global superpower. The British pound sterling, backed by gold and supported by the world's largest navy, became the currency of international trade. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. London was the financial center of the world. Every major trade contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British bonds. This was Stage 1, and it lasted 100 years. Stage 2 began slowly, then accelerated. Maintaining an empire spanning 6 continents required massive expenditures. Britain had to defend India, Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia simultaneously. The cost of the Royal Navy alone consumed enormous resources. And Britain wasn't just defending territory. They were subsidizing industrialization in colonies, building railroads in India, administering governments across dozens of territories. The inflow of wealth from colonial trade was real, but the outflow for imperial maintenance was larger. Then came World War I. Britain faced a choice: stay neutral and watch Europe destroy itself, or join the war and bankrupt the empire to win. They chose war, and the decision shattered the financial foundation of the pound sterling. World War I cost Britain $40 billion. That's over $1 trillion in today's money. They borrowed from everyone, mostly from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America billions. The creditor had become the debtor. They'd won the war, they'd kept the empire, but they'd destroyed the currency's foundation in the process. Stage 3 began in the 1920s. Britain tried to return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The problem was that the pound was overvalued. British goods became too expensive. Manufacturing declined. Unemployment surged. And Britain's gold reserves, drained during the war, couldn't support the currency at the old rate. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't keep its promises. Here's what nobody tells you about that moment. Abandoning gold in 1931 wasn't just a policy shift. It was stage 4 beginning. The pound's credibility as a store of value evaporated. Nations holding pounds as reserves quietly began diversifying, and the acceleration toward full collapse was underway. Section 2. World War II finished what World War I started. Britain entered the war in 1939 with an empire already financially strained. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada over $30 billion, more than Britain's entire GDP. They'd won the war, they'd defeated fascism, and they'd bankrupted the pound sterling in the process. The currency that had ruled global trade for 130 years was finished as a reserve currency. Stage 5 arrived in pieces rather than all at once. In 1947, Britain gave up India, the crown jewel of the empire and the source of massive wealth for 2 centuries. Over the next 25 years, they lost everything: Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books. And the pound, no longer backed by imperial trade flows and global military reach, became a regional currency. It still exists, British citizens still use it, but its role as the global reserve currency transferred completely to the US dollar by 1945. Here's the mechanism that made the transition irreversible. Once the United States became Britain's creditor during the World Wars, the power dynamic inverted. America had the gold. America had the industrial capacity. America had the military reach. The pound didn't collapse because of a single catastrophic event. It collapsed because Stage 4, loss of trust, drained it of international relevance over 30 years, and Stage 5, replacement, happened gradually as the dollar assumed every function the pound once served. The British pound's death followed the exact 5-stage sequence that killed Spanish silver: dominance, overextension, debasement, loss of trust, replacement. The timeline was longer, the mechanisms were more sophisticated, but the pattern was identical, and it wasn't the last time. The French franc offers the most compressed version of currency death in modern history. In the 1720s, France faced a financial crisis. King Louis XV's government was drowning in debt from wars and extravagant spending. Enter John Law, a Scottish economist with a radical proposal: replace gold and silver currency with paper money backed by the potential wealth of France's Louisiana Territory in North America. Law convinced the French government to establish the Banque Royale and issue paper currency, the livre, backed not by metal reserves but by shares in the Mississippi Company, which held monopoly rights to trade in Louisiana. The scheme was Stage 1 and Stage 3 simultaneously. France issued a new form of currency and immediately began expanding the supply. Here's why this matters. Law's system bypassed Stages 1 and 2. France wasn't dominant through production or military supremacy. They were attempting to create dominance through financial engineering, and the paper livre did work briefly. Between 1718 and 1720, the currency facilitated trade, financed government operations, and created a speculative mania as investors bought Mississippi Company shares, expecting limitless returns from American resources. The problem was that the underlying wealth didn't exist. Louisiana wasn't producing anywhere near the returns promised. Law kept printing more currency to buy more shares to drive prices higher. The money supply exploded while real economic production stayed flat. This is Stage 3, debasement on fast forward. Stage 4 arrived in 1720 when investors realized the gap between paper claims and real assets. Panic selling began. Everyone tried to convert paper livres back into gold and silver simultaneously. The Banque Royale didn't have enough metal reserves to honor the conversions. The currency collapsed. Within months, the livre was worthless. John Law fled France in disguise, and Stage 5 was complete before most people understood what had happened. The Mississippi Bubble, as it became known, demonstrated that the five-stage pattern can compress into 2 years when trust collapses suddenly. The French franc that replaced the livre took 200 years to become a reserve currency, and then lost that status after World War II, following the same gradual pattern as the pound. But Law's experiment proved that Stage 4, loss of trust, can accelerate to Stage 5, replacement, in weeks when the debasement becomes undeniable. The Dutch guilder ruled global trade in the 1600s and early 1700s, positioned between the Spanish silver reals' collapse and the British pound's rise. The Netherlands became the world's commercial center through shipping, trade networks, and financial innovation. Amsterdam was the first city with a stock exchange, sophisticated credit markets, and international banking. The guilder was the currency everyone needed because Dutch merchants controlled trade routes between Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Stage 1 was complete by 1650. The guilder was the global reserve currency, but Stage 2 began almost immediately. The Netherlands was a small country trying to maintain a global empire. They fought wars with Britain and France. They funded the Dutch East India Company's operations across Asia. They maintained expensive fleets and fortifications. And, like Spain before them, the costs eventually exceeded the income. Stage 3 was subtle. The Netherlands didn't debase coins as crudely as Spain, but they expanded credit, issued more debt, and allowed the money supply to grow faster than economic output. Stage 4 arrived when British naval power surpassed Dutch capabilities in the late 1700s. The guilder remained a respected currency, but it lost its position as the dominant global medium of exchange. Stage 5 was complete by 1815 when the British pound became the undisputed reserve currency. Here's the pattern that emerges when you compare all four cases. Spanish silver, 90 years from dominance to death. Dutch guilder, 150 years. British pound, 130 years as reserve, then 30 years of managed decline. French livre, under 2 years during the Mississippi Bubble. The timeframes vary wildly, but the five-stage sequence never changes. Every reserve currency begins with real dominance, military, commercial, or productive. Every reserve currency overextends, taking on obligations that exceed capacity. Every reserve currency debases to bridge the gap. Every reserve currency eventually loses trust. And every reserve currency gets replaced. 4 times this pattern has played out. 4 times empires thought they were different. 4 times the mathematics overpowered the politics. And here's what analysts observe when they examine the US dollar today. Structural similarities to stages 3 and 4. Let me show you exactly what that means, because this is where historical pattern meets present uncertainty. Stage 1 for the dollar was complete by 1945. The United States emerged from World War II with intact infrastructure, dominant military power, and the world's largest economy. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formalized the dollar's role as the global reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency pegged to the dollar pegged to gold. America held most of the world's gold reserves. Stage 1. Undisputed dominance. Stage 2 began in the 1960s. The United States financed the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and a global network of military bases without raising taxes proportionally. The gap between spending and revenue widened. Foreign governments holding dollars began presenting them for gold conversion, as Bretton Woods allowed. U.S. gold reserves started flowing out. Stage 3 arrived in 1971. President Nixon closed the gold window, ending dollar-gold convertibility. The dollar became pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except trust in U.S. economic strength and military power. Since 1971, the money supply has expanded dramatically. In 2000, the M2 money supply was 4.6 trillion. By 2020, it was $18 trillion. After COVID stimulus, it hit $21 trillion. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971, measured against gold. Here's what nobody tells you about that statistic. It's Stage 3, debasement, unfolding over 50 years instead of 50 months. The mechanism is identical to Spain mixing copper into silver coins. The modern version just uses digital ledgers instead of metal alloys. Some analysts argue Stage 4, loss of trust, began in the 2010s and accelerated after 2020. Foreign central banks are diversifying reserves away from dollars at the fastest rate in decades. China and Russia settled energy trades in yuan and rubles. BRICS nations developed alternative payment systems. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil exclusively in dollars since 1974, signed agreements to accept yuan for oil sales. These aren't proclamations of dollar abandonment. They're quiet diversifications. But history shows that's exactly how Stage 4 begins. Other economists dispute this interpretation. They note the dollar still comprises 59% of global central bank reserves. The U.S. maintains unmatched military power. The American economy remains the world's largest and most innovative. Treasury bonds remain the safest asset during crises. In their view, the dollar's dominance is structural, not cyclical, and comparing it to the Spanish real or British pound ignores fundamental differences in modern economics. Here's the trap. Both interpretations could be partially correct. The dollar might remain dominant for decades while simultaneously moving through the 5-stage pattern. The British pound took 30 years to transition from reserve currency to regional currency. The process wasn't linear. There were recoveries and setbacks, but the direction was clear in retrospect. If the pattern applies, and that's a conditional if based on historical comparison, not certainty, then 3 scenarios emerge for the dollar's future. Scenario 1, managed decline. The United States acknowledges fiscal limits, reduces military overextension, and allows a multipolar reserve currency system to develop gradually. The dollar remains important, but shares reserve status with the euro, yuan, and possibly digital currencies or a basket of commodities. This is the soft landing. It requires political discipline, international cooperation, and decades of policy adjustment. It's possible. History offers no examples of this succeeding, but the modern global economy is structurally different from the 1600s. Scenario 2, sudden replacement. A financial crisis, military defeat, or rapid loss of confidence triggers Stage 4 acceleration. Foreign nations dump dollar reserves simultaneously. The currency loses 30% to 50% of international purchasing power in months. The United States experiences severe inflation, living standards collapse for the middle class, and a new currency or system of currencies assumes reserve status. This is the hard break. It happened to France in 1720. It could happen to any fiat currency when trust evaporates. Scenario 3, strategic reset. The United States and other major economies deliberately restructure the global monetary system, possibly backing currencies with commodities, creating a new Bretton Woods-style agreement, or transitioning to central bank digital currencies with coordinated controls. This avoids chaotic collapse but requires surrendering monetary sovereignty to international frameworks. It's Stage 5 by negotiation rather than crisis.